I've been trying to script this thing and do fancy editing and all this stuff, and it always just kind of falls apart, so you get what you get. This is my 2021 Tenere 700. It's been my number one bike, usually my only functional bike for the last 3 years. I've put 37,000 miles on it, just about. Done an Iron Butt, Tail of the Dragon, Appalachia, Rockies, Moab, Mexico, Canada, all sorts of stuff. I feel like everything I've ever wanted to do on a motorcycle I've done on this motorcycle. And on the other end of that, I'm not a motorcycle reviewer. I'm not a an experienced motorcycle journalist. I've never ridden an Africa Twin, a KTM 790, a KTM 500, anything really that interesting. I had a 1993 KLR 650 for about 10,000 miles, and then I got really tired of being tortured on the highway and bought a T7. And I think that's kind of an important conversation. I mean, the KLR is a pretty popular motorcycle for a lot of good reasons and a lot of mediocre reasons. And it's really good at showing you, and it did this for me too, it's really good at showing you what you are not willing to compromise on in terms of motorcycles performance. KLR is so shit at absolutely everything that some things you can compromise on, and you learn about that and you learn how to counteract those compromises, and some things are just torturous to compromise on. And that's where I was at with the KLR. I actually liked the way my KLR handled off-road. I know that's blasphemy in the world of dual sports and adventure bikes, but that slow, lumpy engine that just refuses to run away from you, the soft suspension that just kind of rolls over obstacles. I've never been one to go super fast or push the limits of a bike. I've always been more one to push the limits of myself and try to tackle harder and harder obstacles, because that's just my flavor of masochism, I guess. So, in about April of 2020, I think, I was riding at Big Bend and my KLR stranded me for the last time. I was very pissed at it, sold it to a friend for $200 and never wanted to see it again. And I looked around for a replacement, and at the time there wasn't really a whole lot of options, at least in the US. You're jumping up 100 pounds if you're going to the Africa Twin. The 690-701s are piles of garbage. I can't trust an orange or a Swedish bike. Swedish? Austrian? Swedish. The V-Strom at that time had the ground clearance of a shopping cart. You're really just making so many additional compromises. You're just changing your tune when you hop to any other bike in the adventure market, at least going upwards towards better highway performance from a KLR. I almost bought a 701, and I was just crossing my fingers that I wouldn't have all the same problems that my friends were having. Eventually back out of that, and I saw, I was watching the T7 the entire time and waiting for it to come to the US the entire time. And eventually it did, in theory, but you couldn't find anywhere. I couldn't find them at any dealership. You definitely couldn't find them used. So I waited, I put a deposit down on my local dealership, and eventually in Thanksgiving of 2021, I got the call and saw this thing in person for the first time. And it felt like all my online dating experiences, because my first thought was, wow, she's a lot bigger in person. When you first see it in person, it's a little pot-bellied, it's a little gangly, it's really long, especially without a tail tidy. I feel as though the Africa Twin has just a better silhouette, I guess is what I'm trying to say. My first thought, tipping it back and forth, was this thing is fucking top heavy. This bike has so much weight that it carries as high as it possibly can on the bike. I mean, the engine's tall, and it's also up a decent ways from the ground, obviously. And then the gas tank is as high as it possibly can be on the bike without intruding on the riding itself. But then once you start moving, all that weight kind of disappears. It's a very awkward feeling at first. This bike goes from top heavy and kind of difficult to roll around to kind of playful almost, at least coming from a KLR. And so I put the first 500 miles or so in as quick as I could and set off immediately on a 4 or 5 day moto camping adventure going from Austin to Big Bend. And that's where the real adventuring began, I guess. And I was pretty quick to realize I got what I wanted. As far as the highway compromise, moving from the KLR, it was just enough wind protection, just enough comfort on the highway to be what I wanted without sacrificing a lot of the off-road ability. The wind protection for me is just enough to not be exhausting after a long day of riding. I specifically remember one day of 8 hours across Texas, getting to the hotel at like 3 or 4 p.m. and still having the energy to do a hike, to go to Palo Duro Canyon and just hike around. And that's definitely not something I could ever do on the KLR. On another occasion, riding what should be about 8 hours from Galeana, Mexico to Austin, probably more like 9. It ended up being 12 or 13 hours because I had a friend with a DR650 who had to go a bit slower, had to take a couple more rests because those 650 singles are just brutal on the highway, and that's just a fact of those bikes at this point. And at the end of that, I was exhausted, but I was in much better condition than my riding partner. The big problem I kind of ran into with this bike on the highway is gas mileage, or just kind of that top-end performance in general. This bike claims 50 miles to the gallon, and if you're running 65 in 6th gear, sure. But once you start getting up at highway Texas speeds, 75, 80, up to 90 miles an hour, that miles per gallon starts to drop. And it drops even quicker when you have a full load of moto camping gear or trip gear just in general. And then it drops even further when you have a headwind. And so with all those factors combined, you dip all the way down into the lower 30s sometimes. I've seen as low as the upper 20s when I'm just charging straight into the wind at 85, 90 miles an hour. So that 4.2 gallon gas tank just dies when you start pushing those limits, and ultimately that's just I think a limit of 700 cc's. So that's a compromise that I've consciously made by buying this bike, and I understand that. At the end of the day, if you run into those problems, you just have to go 70, 75, which is not super attainable on Texas highways. I've run out of gas almost 3 times, and 2 of those times were in Texas when one gas station, a single gas station, was out of service. Because those Texas gas stations are 50 miles apart when you're in the open country. So 4.2 gallons, if you're doing touring stuff, is just not enough. My solution was a Rotopacks on the Pannier racks, since I'm not going to be carrying extra gas when I'm doing off-road days, which almost screwed me in Moab. But for touring days, yeah, you should usually have some extra gas. That is just something to consider if you're doing long, Midwesty open road days. Street performance, curvy roads, this thing's awesome fun. I mean, even if you're loaded up, even if this bike's a little off balance, you're still carving corners. I'm not a fast street rider. I've never done track or anything like that. Can't complain there. And as far as the off-road stuff goes, well, we got a good forest road back here. Let's go find out. All right, now that we've transported a day later and a couple miles out into the forest, let's do a quick walk around and touch on a couple things before we get to the rest of the performance. Headlights kind of suck, honestly. They're plenty bright, but they're very defined. They give a pentagon, not a pentagon. They give a specific shape with zero diffusion or throw off to the sides, and so when you're doing this stuff or on the street and you tip over, you can only really see 10 feet in front of you. And then the high beams that come on, actually they're on the bottom, they just put kind of a big dot in the center, and so they're plenty bright, and you can still see plenty of stuff when you're out here in the forest where there's no other lights. You just get a big pocket, and then the rest of the forest is completely dark. That's a little worrying, especially with how many deer are out here. What else? The front rim, I've tacoed 2 already. Oh, looks like 3. Yep, I've tacoed 3 already. Whoops. Honestly, I don't know if they're just that soft. 2 of them happened at Big Bend. That one probably happened at Moab. I do hit stuff pretty hard, and so I think just those sharp corners. One of the big issues, at least it was a couple years ago, when you get this replaced, like I probably will at some point, Yamaha doesn't ship the front wheel as a whole. They ship the hub, the spokes, and the rim separately. So when you get it, or if you have a shop do it, they have to lace up this rim, and that ends up as 4 or 5 hours of service. And it ends up costing you $1,500 or something if you're going with stock replacement. What else? The brakes suck. I'll get into that. The Camel is the fix. You can do a little bit with through brake pads, but the Camel thing is the fix. The stock exhaust is a problem. It hangs down here, and the trusty old mark on the swing arm is just a badge of, I won't call it honor, but it's a badge at this point for a lot of T7 owners. When this bike first came out, at least in the US, there were 2 options, the Camel one, but I still didn't like how the Camel was configured, and you had to lop off this piece. At least at the time I had a problem with that. So I went with the Huzar. That comes up and underneath. The Huzar's pretty good, but I've replaced this plate twice, I think, including yesterday. And then this came loose after a while. I just had to make a manual adjustment. So yeah, without further ado, let's hop on it and get going. Before we do that, let's pull a good old Zach Quartz blip here. That's a good sound. All right. Yeah. So that whole playful dance thing that comes from the street is especially fun off-road and completely applies. This thing just dances, and it's pretty amazing for what it's worth. But the problems with that really start coming alive off-road too. You don't get that playfulness for free. The whole thing comes from this long wheelbase that's trailing behind me, and that super short rake that's right up front. Wow, this is really pretty. And along with that rearward weight bias, this front is super light and really prone to deflections. And so if you ride this thing like it feels it should go, and you hit a rock or a tree stump, which there aren't any out here, but there were a bunch back there, you know, you'll just be riding along casually, and all of a sudden your front end just disappears. And if you're not ready for it, that's a recipe for disaster. Along with that, this bike feels, you know, once you get above that 10 mile an hour mark, this bike feels so much lighter than it is. And that part's awesome, but you still have to stop all 450 pounds. I've had a couple wrecks and close calls because you just trust your hands and the bike in front of you, or when you're standing up, the bike that's under you. Woo. Suddenly you realize, coming up to a turn, that you're going way too fast. Oh, like this. Holy shit. Especially with the stock tires, that can be a dangerous combination. Woo. Oh. Okay. And you can see I'm starting to, well, not starting to, I always hit these rocks. If I can't avoid a rock completely, I hit it head on.
because I can't afford to hit these tree branches or roots or rocks at an oblique angle. Even with the steering stabilizer on it, there's still a decent chance that the front end just disappears out from under me. Howdy, sir. This way? Sure. So there's this awkward truth you have to come to terms with on this bike, where you always have to be consciously, not subconsciously, consciously thinking about this bike's weight and behavior. Oh, like that, holy shit. And you can't just trust your hands, you can't just trust your head and your arms and legs and feet. You have to consciously be aware at all times that you're riding a 450-pound motorcycle. That's a really awkward truth to manage after a while, especially at first too, of course. But man, once you get a handle on that, this bike's so much fun to just toss around on these forest roads. Ooh. Suspension, I guess. I don't have a super educated opinion on suspension. Coming from a KLR. Like I said, I actually like the way the KLR suspension felt. The conclusion that I eventually came to is that the shock is pretty good. I still haven't replaced it. I've replaced the springs, of course, but shock itself, not too bad. The forks are terrible, though. I messed with them relentlessly when I got the bike, and you know, deep into the ownership of this bike, I was just messing with their settings the entire time, and the shock settings. Never find a comfortable place. And then I finally swapped K-Tech cartridges into this and did a couple other things, and I've got it to a pretty good point now. I will also mention that the other little bit of info that I've seen and have felt dramatically is that this bike is super sensitive to spring imbalance front to back, if that makes sense. If you upgrade the rear spring on this bike and you don't upgrade the fork springs, suddenly this bike gets extremely out of balance and harsh and bouncy and irritated in a way that's more dramatic than it was on my KLR. On my KLR, I just replaced the rear spring. The bike was fantastic, but that was not the case for this bike. Like I mentioned earlier, the brakes, I actually like the front brakes in stock form. They're squishy. Ooh, they are squishy. There's no denying that. If you're only going to do street stuff, it's probably going to suck. But when you're rushing through all these forest things and there's all these little embedded rocks and roots and this junk, you need to brake. I like a little give on that lever with how much the handlebars just tend to jump up and down. The rear brake is terrible though. There's absolutely no excuse for a rear brake like that in stock form. It's just squishy, there's no feel, it eventually locks up, but it's borderline unusable, at least unusable in a technical way off-road. And the fix is the fix. Shout out to CamelAdv as per usual. Also related to CamelAdv, when I first got this, the clutch throw, or maybe friction zone slash throw slash pull effort was, oh, you know what, let's do that. Was way too short, and it was making it pretty tough to handle technical terrain with how much I like to use my clutch. And once again, the fix was CamelAdv's one finger, oh, I hate ruts, one finger clutch arm. Does a fantastic job, fixes that problem immediately. Ooh. So all that leads back to, like, woo, if you ride this bike how it feels it should be ridden, you get yourself into trouble real quick. Where the hell am I? Woo. Oh, yeah. Speaking of getting myself into trouble. Ooh. Whee. So, I feel like I just complained about this bike for about 30 minutes, but I mean, when you're trying to avoid what everybody else is saying about this bike, that's kind of all you can do. At the end of the day, I mean, I've ridden this thing for 8 hours a day. I've done 16 hours in a day. I've done 4,000 miles in 10 days. Like, this bike can do the long days, and then it just eats this stuff up. It takes a lot more effort. You can hear that, I'm sure. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's still a blast. It can take you to places like these. If you haven't ridden in northern Arizona, it's a pretty cool place. I think the last thing I have to say is, if this bike got stolen, if this bike disappeared tomorrow, and I had all the money in the world, I'd buy the same thing again. Thanks for watching.